Welcome to the Unwashed Asses, episode 128, recorded for Friday, September 20th, 2019. Just a quick programming note here at the top of the show. This one's going to be delving a lot into video games, so if that's not your jam, tune out now. I know a couple of listeners have been sounding off as far as, oh no, I don't really listen to video game ones, I just kind of tune out, so I'm going to see if that's something I can address in the future. I don't necessarily want to do a separate spin-off show, but we'll do it one at a time. In this case, we're just going to post a big disclaimer. So if video games aren't your thing, just feel free to skip this one. But if video games are your thing, especially video games that go over bonding experiences between a father and a son, then by all means, pull up a chair, sit down, because we're going to talk some God of War. I know last week I did a bit of a preview, doing a basic overview of the game itself, and now that I've finally beaten it, I think I can sit down and competently put together my thoughts and feelings on the game and give you an impression as far as what I thought of it and whether or not you should play it. Because, I mean, honestly, that's what all reviews break down to, is whether or not you think the experience would be enjoyable for another person and present that enjoyability to you. So, God of War, it takes a big departure from previous titles in the series. This is one of many games in the overall God of War pantheon, but it's the first to share a title with another. It doesn't necessarily act as a reboot of the series, but it is a very large departure from the series. Whereas in previous entries, we had Kratos, the titular god of war, waging war. There's going to be a lot of god war, just those words are going to be thrown around a lot here, on the Greek pantheon, and sowing utter chaos as he goes about his task of vengeance. Game goes on simmer. We had it started off on the PlayStation 2 era, moved its way onto PlayStation 3. We also had it on the PSP, and overall they were largely acclaimed, critically successful games, commercially and critically. So several years pass by, and then we get a hint at a new game where it's Kratos in a different perspective, rather than having the fixed camera and the action-y Devil May Cry Bayonetta style combat. It's a more over-the-shoulder focused perspective, and he has a son, and it doesn't look like he's in Greece. He's in Norse mythology, and sure enough, that's where this latest entry from Santa Monica Studios takes us. Kratos, not to get too spoilery here, has disappeared from the lands of Sparta and Greece entirely and has now taken up residence inside Norse mythology in the realm of Midgard. And the game opens with him and his son Atreus preparing a funeral pyre for Kratos' now deceased wife and Atreus' mother. And this puts us on a journey of the two trying to fulfill I don't know that we ever Frey. Let me see. I'm going to do a quick Google search. I didn't think this was going to come up. I apologize. It's extremely unprofessional. Faye. Okay. It was Faye. I was right. Good job, me. Where Faye's last wishes were to have her ashes dispersed or scattered from the tallest peak in all the 9 realms. And this begins us on a journey across said realms as Kratos is now confronted by gods and mythical figures inside the Greek pantheon, Norse pantheon, such as Balder and Magni and Brock and Jormungandr. And it puts him it paints a picture of him as a stranger in a new land. And not only that, but also a stranger to the player, where we're used to a very angry and confident Kratos, knowing what he wants and going about and doing it in a very gory, bloody fashion. But now we see a more reserved Kratos, a person who has clearly had a lot happen in his life and is looking to turn a page and start a new chapter. And it puts us in a timeline where we've missed that chapter, where he's disappeared, he's clearly found happiness, he's started a family, and now that family's kind of come to an end, and he's left to raise his son on his own. And Kratos, being the very angry person he is also very emotionally stunted. And to have this relationship between him and a young boy, Atreus, is just utterly phenomenal. The way in which the story works through their respective issues, because not only is it just the awkwardness of Kratos being a father, it's the fact that they're both dealing with loss of a loved one, a person who was very significant to their world. And what's alluded to is they lived a very isolated life. So to essentially have 1/3 of your world disappear is profoundly heartbreaking. And to see the two characters deal with it in their own ways, and then the way they come together over this loss and journey as a whole, I mean, this is writing at its finest. This is it shares the summit with very few select other titles, as far as its ability to craft a story and reel you in and get you so emotionally invested in characters. Like Kratos, I did not care about him before in the other God of Wars, but in this one, I was so emotionally wrapped up in not only his well-being, but in the well-being of Atreus himself, where, you know, the first half of the game, I'm screaming, just hug your son. Just hug him. Is it going to hurt so much to let him in? But Kratos thinks he's doing the best thing by protecting him and blocking out not necessarily those feelings, but not showing him the weakness that Kratos perceives in himself. And it's kind of like watching a horror movie. It's like, don't go upstairs. You know, you kind of see what would be obvious, but as we can all relate, inside that position, it's not so obvious. And, you know, sharing emotions and feelings is hard. And it is just wonderfully acted out. And I cannot say enough good things about it. The game balances, you know, not only the sadness and the tragedy of the situation, but also brings in moments of levity where the pacing never really feels off. Even if you choose to ignore the main storyline and go off onto side stories, you have an overall pacing of where the relationship between all of the characters is. And it works to such great effect, where I never felt really disjointed in how I chose to tackle the game. It was extremely clever in how they managed to wrangle it all together into one nice, neat package. That being said, the story from start to finish was eye-opening for me, not only in the sense that I get to see characters painted in a new light, but I'm also exposed to a brand new mythology. Norse mythology is something I'm only vaguely aware of, largely due to Marvel Comics and Thor, and to a lesser extent, like American Gods, and essentially media. Mainstream media is how I'm aware of Norse mythology. It's not like we had a course in it in high school like we did with medieval mythologies like King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and then the Greek mythology. It's always come through movies, shows, and games, Smite being a large part of that, but it wasn't anything that really captured my interest. Vikings weren't necessarily my jam. But between this and I can't remember. Hellblade. There we go. Between this and Hellblade, I am now fascinated by the Greek mythology. Not Greek. I keep saying Greek because my mind just immediately thinks mythology. Greek. It's Greek mythology. By the Norse mythology. And Turns out Neil Gaiman, same guy who did American Gods, actually put together a fantastic compilation of a large chunk of the Norse mythology and stories, and offers it as a retelling. And from everything I've read, it's fairly accurate, and from what I've read of the book itself, is thoroughly entertaining, and really starts to flesh out these characters in a way that makes more sense. Sure, God of War takes its liberties and goes the way it wants to, and does things differently, because of course in the mythologies themselves you didn't have this crazy Spartan from the Greek mythologies coming in and slaughtering a pantheon. They were doing that to themselves. So it works, and then it's also opened up this new avenue of entertainment for me, where I can now be the smart guy and read things and learn and educate myself and grow. And they're actually making very good stories too to tell my son at night. So it all kind of comes full circle. And I guess before we move on to touching on the last bits of the story, I don't know if it was just more emotionally impactful as somebody who has their own father issues and is, now forced into the role of, not necessarily forced into, who now finds themselves in the role of being a father and trying to raise a son. There were just so many parallels, and it was just one emotional gut punch after the other, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. The way it was told was just sublime. But also, I shouldn't say also, but because segues are hard, but let's get into gameplay. So gameplay is a rough one in the sense that it doesn't necessarily flow or feel right, and if there is a flaw within God of War, it is how the game itself plays, mostly in terms of combat. The game itself is broken up into sections of exploration. You're presented with a new area. You need to get from point A to point B. This usually involves navigating, doing platforming puzzles, using Atreus to get to areas where Kratos can't necessarily get, using tools like his Leviathan axe to freeze things or hold them in place, using Atreus to read runes and solve riddles. All of that works very well. It doesn't necessarily feel like a chore. It's not always unwelcome. It just becomes an accepted thing, and the way that each area is broken up in each zone you go to is varied enough that you have the same core concepts going through each of the dungeons and the puzzles, but it never feels like a slog. Like other games where, say a shooter, you go into an area and you're not going to leave until you've shot every single person in that area, and it's simply a rinse and repeat of that formula. God of War kind of breaks it up. And it helps that there's a lot of side objectives to tackle along the way, so that even if you are kind of getting tired of one thing, you can always move to another easily enough. Be it taking on tasks for the Dwarven Forge Masters, Brock and Sindri, exploring old dungeons, freeing dragons, fighting dragons, or uncovering runes. And what also helps with this is that each area or each of the realms, be it Niflheim, Muspel, or Midgard, or any of the others, has enough variety in the environment itself that it never gets very stale. And though you may travel back and forth between all of them, there's variety enough to make the gameplay satisfying. Even things like quick time events, which are just more for the cinematic moments to progress the story in a fight rather than just leaving it to chance of the player. Yes, you have a life bar. They have a life bar. The objective is to make theirs go down, but once you've hit that point, it just becomes a cinematic experience, and hitting the correct buttons to get that experience to play out entirely. But the combat itself, while overall is very strong, isn't balanced in the sense that early on in the game, I felt like I was just playing it very wrong, that I was doing very poorly at it. But it turns out that you just start off very ungeared and underleveled for what they throw at you. And I mean, relatively, the enemies that you encounter early on are easy enough, aside from the troll. It's a matter of investing in equipment and gear in both Kratos and Atreus, gear and skills, which then opens up the game where some things that would feel intuitive as far as abilities and actions don't actually happen until you've invested the experience points into them. And for that, I don't know if I've just become more accustomed to games that play on a certain skill set. Like, I'm going to compare it largely to Bloodborne here, where you have that third person over the shoulder camera style. You have to pay attention to what your enemy is doing, memorize their attacks, know their patterns, and that's going to lead you to victory. While that's largely true in God of War, there's another big part of it where you have an item level, essentially, and that determines the strength of the enemies that you run into, where they'll have their own item level, they'll have their own health bar, depending on the color of the health bar, gives you an idea of how hard the fight it's going to be, essentially how much damage they're going to take and how much damage they can inflict on you. And so, while you might run across a green health bar enemy, that is a normal to easy fight. As soon as you come across something with like a purple, it's going to be near impossible, no matter how well you do in terms of dodging, countering, blocking, because most instances it's going to be a one-hit kill, which doesn't feel very fair. It feels a little out of place in the game, where I have to apply the Final Fantasy mentality of, all right, well, even though the game unlocked this side story for me to do it this time, I can't do it. Why did they give it to me at this time when I'm clearly not ready for it? And I have to go farm out for several hours doing other more manageable side stories or progressing the main story, upping my gear score so then I can come back. Another issue with it then becomes with navigating the world. God of War, while it's not large, it is very dense in what it offers players and how much is strewn about the world itself, especially in Midgard, which plays host to a large part of the story and side quests. A lot of the time is going to be spent paddling around in a boat, going into these caves and inlets and finding your various objectives. The other issue then lies into, slight spoilers here, when Jormungandr shows up, and as he raises out of the water level goes down, which then opens up new areas to navigate and explore around the map, and this happens twice. So, say you, like in my instance, I couldn't complete a side mission and decided I would come back to it later. Well, by that time, the lake level had changed twice, and I had no idea how to get back to what it was I was after. So in that instance, it's very unfriendly in terms of, like, I have a fairly good sense of direction in terms of navigating games, finding what I'm after, because, classic games, it's very clear where the game wants you to go, but because you don't want to miss anything, be it loot or side missions, you go the opposite way, so you become very attuned to, all right, well, I want to go this way, but I need to go this way instead. And so navigation, while a little counterintuitive, it makes sense. So when the game actually works, though, is when you do find that sweet spot of, I'm at the right level for this, I have the right gear, I have the right skills, and especially towards the end game, once you start maxing out all of these things. And I will say this came a lot faster than I anticipated it to. Like, the game plays so very, very quickly. I'm not sure what my total playtime was, but it felt like it was over. Unlike well before I wanted it to be. It left me wanting more, and I did my utmost to complete as many side objectives as I could. There's only a couple things left, like hunting down the Valkyries and taking down the Niflheim and Mooseville dungeons in their entirety, which essentially just break down to hard modes and challenge modes, and they're not integral to story whatsoever. So while that's there, the overall game itself went very, very quickly, and that was largely due to how well the pacing was set up in terms of the story, and then how well the side missions played into it. Even if I did run into hiccups here and there, overall, this game was over in the blink of an eye, unlike Spider-Man, where I was just wishing for it to be over. It makes me a little sad that there wasn't additional DLC released, but at the same time, I feel it might have cheapened the game overall, and it makes me want the sequel that much more, where I don't care if it ends up being an exclusive for PlayStation 5, which it most likely will. At that point, my hand's forced. I have to get a PlayStation 5 to continue this story. It's one of those titles that, and Sony's been doing this tremendously well this generation. It's one of those titles where it is well worth the purchase of the console to get it. Maybe not right away, but when you get a good sale at like $200 or $250, absolutely pick it up. It's phenomenal. But yeah, aside from those few difficulty spikes, it's very, very well put. Changing the combat style between the Leviathan Axe and the Blades of Chaos, buying gear for Atreus, and choosing how to play with him as a secondary character, which it works well. Not as well as like BioShock Infinite was the best in terms of having a secondary character, because you literally never had to worry about them getting attacked or abducted by enemies. Elizabeth was nothing but helpful. And Atreus, while largely self-sufficient and in some instances will carry a fight for you, because for a big chunk of the game you only have one weapon, which is the Leviathan Axe, and it has a frost element bound to it. But you're also encountering Draugr, which have a frost element themselves. And the Leviathan Axe does nothing. So until you get those Blades of Chaos, you're stuck using your fists, your shield, or in this case, you're cheesing them with Atreus as Kratos just runs from one side of the room to the other, and you just are waiting for that cooldown on the arrows to keep spamming them. And that's part of that pacing issue that I was talking about, where if I had more of a clear indication to progress the main story to get the Blades of Chaos, which have the fire element and which make me more versatile all around, it would have been better as a whole. However, because I was trying to do as much side content as I could, for fear of, missing out, I was handicapping myself severely, and there was no need for it. That also being said, the economy in the game isn't very difficult to maintain. Starting out is rough, but if you just play the game and do all the side content that you can, or even do the Muspel or Niflheim challenges, money, materials, it's never really an issue. And I'm torn. Like, it strikes a nice middle ground, but at the same time, it also felt a little easy. Getting into graphics, it is a visual stunner. It is one of, if not the best looking games on the PlayStation. And it was a game that I played almost exclusively with the PlayStation Remote Play. And even then, while I wasn't getting full crisp textures and resolution, it was still utterly mind-blowing at how gorgeous it was. And getting the frame rate that I did out of it, again, I don't even have a PS4 Pro, it was astounding at how pretty it was, where in many instances, like especially around Freya's cottage, I would just sit there and look, and when you stare at the majesty that is the Jormungandr and this behemoth serpent wrapped around the entire world, literally the world, because he's the world serpent, the sense of scale that they portray and put forth it's mind-blowing. And there wasn't a single instance where I saw, clipping or pop-in. It all runs so remarkably smooth, and it does better than I feel it has any right to. The detail alone on Kratos' face as he interacts, and seeing all the textures and the rivets and the stitching on the leather work, and it's Horizon Zero Dawn comes very, very close, but because of the future tech in it, it also feels a little bit fake, and the faces feel a little bit plastic in some of them. But in God of War, it's all so raw and real, and it might be the prettiest game I've ever seen. And for that alone, I mean, it's worth going through at least the first section where you're going on the hunt with Atreus and finding the wood for Faye's funeral pyre. And that's the thing too, is as you move through all the different realms, and they have these wonderfully different environments where Muspelheim is all volcano and fire and ash, and Niflheim is mist and choking shadows, and Hell is this frozen wasteland of mist and icy towers, and Midgard is this idyllic, beautiful paradise. And then even seeing the world tree itself, Yggdrasil, transform and change to match the theme, like that itself is a series of wallpapers. It's just stunning to look at. I mean, there were no flaws. I couldn't find anything wrong in terms of graphics. Each scene left me, stunned and looking forward to something. Even, going through the mountains and the mines themselves, where it was all just lovingly rendered and detailed. The same thing also applies for the soundtrack, or the sound design itself. There's not a lot of music in God of War. Music only really picks up in battles or in emotional moments, but overall there's not much backing music as you play the game. It comes down more to the storytelling between Kratos and Atreus, or later as you get to Mimir and listen to his stories of the old Norse gods. And it's always this, I won't say it's incessant talking, but again, a lot of the story is being told not through cutscenes, but as you play the game, as Kratos talks to the boy, as you encounter the Witch of the Woods, Freya, or speak with the merchants. There's only a handful of characters, but each of them has such depth to them and such wonderful storytelling, and how they portray themselves with their each unique personalities. And the voice acting is as good as phenomenal as the visuals themselves. And there wasn't a single moment where I felt that something was out of place or something sounded weird or off. It was just top-notch performance. And I can't sing enough the praises of the voice work itself, because when you don't have much musical going on in the game, it really, the weight is being carried by those voice actors, especially in a game where there's so much story being told between so few characters. Just astonishing. And I guess that kind of leaves the impact here, where while God of War isn't a perfect game and there are some flaws, kind of like people or characters in general, it's the flaws that make you appreciate everything more. It makes it more real, it makes it stand out. And they're not nearly enough to detract from the overall experience. There's so much good happening with this game, and it's one of those where I would encourage even people who don't play games to watch a playthrough of it, because, again, the biggest joy I get out of gaming and playing games is story. It's just a different way to experience a story, and God of War takes it to such a different level that it stands in a very elite class, where I only put a handful of other games. The two that come to mind would be Hellblade and then BioShock Infinite. I can't think of any other game where I've sat and been so emotionally impacted by the story being told to me. And for that alone, God of War is a must-buy. If you don't have a PlayStation, get one. If you can't buy one, borrow one. Just find a way to play this game. If games aren't your thing, watch a playthrough of it. Because while you can skip like a lot of the combat and whatnot, because there's so much story being told between set pieces, it's worth however many hours it takes to get through, because of how well this story is told. And for that, yeah, it's a must buy. So that's going to wrap this up. We'll have another episode up here going over Borderlands 3, just kind of churning through games one after the other. But if you have your own thoughts or feelings, concerns, criticisms, critiques, complaints, or just want to shoot the shit, emails down in the show notes. And of course, we have the store link. I'm hoping to get a few more pieces up there shortly. But that's going to wrap it up. We'll talk to you here shortly. Blood for the Blood God.